Hello once again. Today we are going to do Tuck Everlasting, chapters 6 through 10. So, not very long book, not a very long book, I should say. And the story is getting really interesting. So, let's get on with it. Chapter 6. Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. Afterward, when she thought about it, it seemed to Winnie that the next few minutes were only a blur. First, she was kneeling on the ground, insisting on a drink from the spring, and the next thing she knew, she was seized and swung through the air, open-mouthed, and found herself straddling the bouncing back of the fat old horse with Miles and Jessie trotting along on either side, while May ran puffing ahead, dragging on the bridle. Winnie had often been haunted by visions of what it would be like to be kidnapped, but none of her visions had been like this, with her kidnappers just as alarmed as she was herself. She had always pictured a troop of burly men with long black mustaches who would tumble her into a blanket and bear her off like a sack of potatoes while she pleaded for mercy. But instead, it was they, May, Tuck, and Miles and Jessie, who were pleading. "Please, child, dear child, don't be scared." This was May trying to run and call back over her shoulder at the same time. "We wouldn't harm you for the world if you'd yelled or anything." This was Jessie. "Someone might have heard you, and that's too risky." And Miles said, We'll explain it as soon as we're far enough away." Winnie herself was speechless. She clung to the saddle and gave herself up to the astonishing fact that though her heart was pounding and her backbone felt like a pipe full of cold running water, her head was fiercely calm. Disconnected thoughts presented themselves one by one, as if they had been waiting their turn in line. "So, this is what it's like to ride a horse. I was going to run away today anyway. What will they say when they find I'm not there for breakfast? Oh, I wish the toad could see me now. That woman is worried about me. Miles is taller than Jessie. I'd better duck if I don't want this next branch to knock me off." They had come to the edge of the wood now, with no sign of slowing their rapid jog. The road, where it angled across the meadow, was just ahead, dazzling white in the open sunlight. And there, standing on the road, was the man from the night before, the man in the yellow suit, his black hat on his head. Discovering him, seeing his surprise, and presented at once with choices, Winnie's mind perversely went blank. Instead of crying out for help, she merely goggled at him as they fled past the spot where he stood. May Tuck was the only one who spoke, and the most she could offer was, "Teaching our little girl how to ride." Only then did it come to Winnie that she ought to shout, wave her arms, do something. But the man had fallen away behind that time, and she was afraid to let go of the saddle, afraid to turn around, lest she fall off the horse. In another moment, it was too late. They had sped up the hill and down its other side, and the opportunity was lost. After another few minutes, the road led them to a place where, off to the left, a shallow stream looped near with willows and sheltering scrubby bushes. "Stop!" cried May. "We'll stop here." Miles and Jessie grabbed at the horse's harness, and he pulled up abruptly, nearly toppling Winnie off over his neck. "Lift the poor child down," May gasped, her chest heaving. "We'll go catch our breath by the water and try to put things straight before we go on." But the explanation, once they had stumbled to the banks of the stream, came hard. May seemed embarrassed, and Miles and Jessie fidgeted, glancing at their mother uneasily. No one knew how to begin. For her part, Winnie, now that the running was over, began to comprehend what was happening, and with that comprehension her throat closed, and her mouth went dry as paper. This was no vision. This was real. Strangers were taking her away. They might do anything. She might never see her mother again. And then, thinking of her mother, she saw herself as small, weak, and helpless, and she began to cry, suddenly crushed as much by the outrage as by shock. May Tuck's round face wrinkled in dismay. "Dear Lord, don't cry. Please don't cry, child," she implored. "We're not bad people. Truly we're not. We had to bring you away. You'll see why in a minute. And we'll take you back just as soon as we can. Tomorrow, I promise." When May said tomorrow, Winnie's sobs turned to wails. Tomorrow! It was like being told she would be kept away forever. She wanted to go home now, at once, rush back to the safety of the fence and her mother's voice from the window. May reached out to her, but she twisted away, her hands over her face, and gave herself up to weeping. "This is awful," said Jessie. "Can't you do something, Ma? This poor little tad." "We ought to have had some better plan than this," said Miles. "That's the truth," said May helplessly. "The dear Lord knows there's been time enough to think of one, and it had to happen sooner or later. We've been plain bone lucky it hasn't before now. But I never expected it'd be a child." She reached distractedly into the pocket of her skirt and took out the music box, and without thinking twisted the winding key with trembling fingers. When the tinkling little melody began, Winnie's sobbing slowed. She stood by the stream, her hands still over her face, and listened. Yes, it was the same music she had heard the night before. Somehow it calmed her. It was like a ribbon tying her to familiar things, she thought. "When I get home, I'll tell Granny it wasn't elf music after all." She wiped her face as well as she could with her wet hands and turned to May. "That's the music I heard last night," she managed between recovering snuffles. "When I was out in my yard, my Granny said it was elves." "Dear me, no," said May, peering at her hopefully. "It's only my music box. I didn't suppose anyone could hear it." She held it out to Winnie. "Do you want to take a look at it?" "It's pretty," said Winnie, taking the little box and turning it over in her hands. The winding key was still revolving, but more and more slowly. The melody faltered. Another few widely spaced notes blinked, and then it stopped. "Wind it up if you want to," said May, "clockwise." Winnie turned the key. It clicked faintly, and then after several more turns, the music began to play again, brisk from its fresh winding and merry. No one who owned a thing like this could be too disagreeable. Winnie examined the painted roses and lilies of the valley and smiled in spite of herself. "It's pretty," she repeated, handing it back to May. The music box had relaxed them all. Miles dragged a handkerchief from a back pocket and mopped at his face, and May sank down heavily on a rock, pulling off the blue straw hat and fanning herself with it. "Look here," Winnie Foster said. "Winnie Foster," said Jessie, "we're friends. We really are. But you got to help us. Come sit down and we'll try to tell you why." Chapter 7. It was the strangest story Winnie had ever heard. She soon suspected they had never told it before, except to each other, that this was their first real audience, for they gathered around her like children at their mother's knee, each trying to claim her attention, and sometimes they all talked at once and interrupted each other in their eagerness. 87 years before, the Tucks had come from a long way to the east, looking for a place to settle. In those days, the wood was not a wood. It was a forest, just as her grandmother had said, a forest that went on and on and on. They had thought they would start a farm as soon as they came to the end of the trees. But the trees never seemed to end. When they came to the part that was now the wood and turned from the trail to find a camping place, they happened on the spring. "It was real nice," said Jessie with a sigh. "It looked just the way it does now. A clearing and lots of sunshine. That big tree with all those knobby roots." We stopped and everyone took a drink, even the horse. "No," said May, "the cat didn't drink. That's important." "Yes," said Miles, "don't leave that out. We all had a drink except for the cat." "Well, anyway," Jessie went on, "the water tasted sort of strange, but we camped there overnight and Pa carved a T on the tree trunk to mark where we'd been, and then we went on." They had come out of the forest at last, many miles to the west, had found a thinly populated valley, had started their farm. "We put up a house for Ma and Pa," said Miles, "and a little shack for Jessie and me. We figured we'd be starting families of our own pretty soon and would want our own houses." "That was the first time we figured there was something peculiar," said May. Jessie fell out of a tree. "I was way up in the middle," Jessie interrupted, "trying to saw off some of the big branches before we cut her down. I lost my balance and I fell." "He landed plumb on his head," said May with a shudder. "We thought for sure he'd broke his neck, but come to find out it didn't hurt him a bit." "Not long after," Miles went on, "some hunters come by one day at sunset. The horse was out grazing by some trees and they shot him. Mistook him for a deer, they said. Can you fancy that? But the thing is, they didn't kill him. The bullet went right on through him and didn't hardly even leave a mark. Then Pa got snake bite, and Jessie ate the poisoned toadstools, and I cut myself," said May. "Remember, slicing bread." But it was the passage of time that worried them most. They had worked the farm, settled down, made friends, but after 10 years, then 20, they had to face the fact that there was something terribly wrong. None of them was getting any older. I was more than 40 by then," said Miles sadly. "I was married, I had 2 children, but from the look of me, I was still 22. My wife, she finally made up her mind I'd sold my soul to the devil. She left me. She went away and she took the children with her." "I'm glad I never got married," Jessie put in. "It was the same with our friends," said May. "They come to pull back from us. There was talk about witchcraft, black magic. Well, you can't hardly blame them, but finally we had to leave the farm. We didn't know where to go. We started back the way we come, just wandering. We was like gypsies. When we got this far, it changed, of course. A lot of the trees was gone. There was people and Tree Gap. It was a new village. The road was here, but in those days it was mostly just a cow path. They went on into what was left of the wood to make a camp, and when we got to the clearing and the tree in the spring, we remembered it from before. It hadn't changed no more'n we had," said Miles, "and that was how we found out. Pa'd carved a T on the tree, remember? 20 years before. But the tea was just where it'd been when he done it. That tree hadn't grown one whit in all that time. It was exactly the same. And the tea he'd carved was as fresh as if it had been put there. Then they had remembered drinking the water, they and the horse, but not the cat. The cat had lived a long and happy life on the farm, but had died some 10 years before. So they decided at last that the source of their changelessness was the spring. When we come to that conclusion, May went on, Tuck said, that's my husband, Angus Tuck, he said he had to be sure once and for all. He took his shotgun and he pointed it at himself the best way he could, and before we could stop him, he pulled the trigger. There was a long pause. May's fingers laced together in her lap, twisted with the tension of remembering. At last she said, the shot knocked him down, went into his heart. It had to, the way he aimed, and right on through him. It scarcely left even a mark. Just like, like you shot a bullet through water, and he was just the same as if he'd never done it. After that, we went sort of crazy, said Jessie, grinning at the memory. Heck, we was going to live forever. Can you picture what it felt like to find that out? But then we sat down and talked it over, said Miles. We're still talking it over, Jessie added. And we figured it'd be very bad if anyone knowed about that spring, said May. We began to see what it would mean. She peered at Winnie. Do you understand, child? That water, it stops you right where you are. If you had drunk of it today, you'd stay a little girl forever. You'd never grow up, not ever. We don't know how it works or even why, said Miles. Pa thinks it's something left over from some other plan for the way the world should be, said Jessie. Some plan that didn't work out too good, and so everything was changed. Except that spring was passed over somehow or other. Maybe he's right. I don't know. But you see, Winnie Foster, when I told you before I'm 104 years old, I was telling the truth. But I'm really only 17. And so far as I know, I'll stay 17 till the end of the world. Chapter 8. Winnie did not believe in fairy tales. She had never longed for a magic wand, did not expect to marry a prince, and was scornful most of the time of her grandmother's elves. So now she sat, mouth open, wide-eyed, not knowing what to make of this extraordinary story. It couldn't, not a bit of it, be true. And yet, it feels so fine to tell somebody, Jessie exploded. Just think, Winnie Foster, you're the only person in the world besides us who knows about it. Hold on now, Miles said cautiously. Maybe not. There might be a whole lot of others, for all we know, wandering around just like us. Maybe, but we don't know them, Jessie pointed out. We've never had anyone but us talk about it to Winnie. We've never had anyone but us to talk about it to. Winnie, isn't it peculiar and kind of wonderful? Just think of all the things we've seen in the world. All the things we're going to see. That kind of talk will make her want to rush back and drink a gallon of the stuff, warned Miles. There's a whole lot more to it than Jessie Tuck's good times, you know. Oh, stuff, said Jessie with a shrug. We might as well enjoy it long as we can't change it. You don't have to be such a parson all the time. I'm not being a parson, said Miles. I just think you ought to take it more serious. Now, boys, said May. She was kneeling by the stream, splashing her face and hands with cool water. Phew, such weather, she exclaimed, sitting back on her heels. She unfastened the brooch, took off her shawl, and toweled her dripping face. Well, child, she said to Winnie, standing up. Now, you share our secret. It's a big, dangerous secret. We got to have your help to keep it. I expect you're full of questions, but we can't stay here no longer." She tied the shawl around her waist then and sighed. "It pains me to think how your Ma and Pa will worry, but there's just no way around it. We got to take you home with us. That's the plan. Tuck, he'll want to talk it out, make sure you see why you can't tell no one. But we'll bring you back tomorrow, all right?" And all three of them looked at her hopefully. "All right," said Winnie, for she decided there wasn't any choice. She would have to go. They would probably make her go anyway, no matter what she said. But she felt there was nothing to be afraid of. Not really. For they seemed gentle and, in a strange way, childlike. They made her feel old. And the way they spoke to her, the way they looked at her, made her feel special, important. It was a warm, spreading feeling, entirely new. She liked it, and in spite of their stories, she liked them too, especially Jessie. But it was Miles who took her hand and said, "It's really fine to have you along, even if it's only for a day or two." Then Jessie gave a great whoop and leapt into the stream, splashing mightily. "What'd you bring for breakfast, Ma?" he cried. "We can eat on the way, can't we? I'm starving." So with the sun riding high now in the sky, they started off again, noisy in the August stillness, eating bread and cheese. Jessie sang funny old songs in a loud voice and swung like a monkey from the branches of trees, showing off shamelessly for Winnie, calling to her, "Hey, Winnie Foster, watch me, and look what I can do." And Winnie, laughing at him, lost the last of her alarm. They were friends, her friends. She was running away after all, but she was not alone. Closing the gate on her oldest fears as she had closed the gate of her own fenced yard, she discovered the wings she'd always wished she had, and all at once she was elated. Where were the terrors she had been told she should expect? She could not recognize them anywhere. The sweet earth opened out its wide four corners to her like the petals of a flower ready to be picked, and it shimmered with light and possibility till she was dizzy with it. Her mother's voice, the feel of home, receded for the moment, and her thoughts turned forward. Why, she too might live forever in this remarkable world she was only just discovering. The story of the spring. It might be true. So that when she was not rolling along on the back of the fat old horse, by choice this time, she ran shouting down the road, her arms flung out, making more noise than anybody. It was good. So good, in fact, that through it all, not one of them noticed that the man they had passed on the road, the man in the yellow suit, had crept up to the bushes by the stream and heard it all. The whole fantastic story. Nor did they notice that he was following now, beside the road far behind, his mouth above the thin gray beard, turned ever so slightly toward a smile. Chapter 9. The August sun rolled up, hung at mid-heaven for a blinding hour, and at last wheeled westward before the journey was done. But Winnie was exhausted long before that. Miles carried her some of the way. The tops of her cheeks were bright pink with sunburn, her nose a vivid comic red, but she had been rescued from a more serious broiling by May, who had finally insisted that she wear the blue straw hat. It came down far over her ears and gave her a clownish appearance. The shade from its brim was so welcome that Winnie put vanity aside and dozed gratefully in Miles's strong arms. Her own arms wound around his neck. The pastures, fields, and scrubby groves they crossed were vigorous with bees, and crickets leapt before them, as if each step released a spring and flung them up like pebbles. But everything else was motionless, dry as a biscuit, on the brink of burning, hoarding final reservoirs of sap, trying to hold out till the rain returned and Queen Anne's lace lay dusty on the surface of the meadows, like foam on a painted sea. It was amazing, then, to climb a long hill, to see ahead another hill, and beyond that the deep green of a scattered pine forest. And as you climbed, you feel the air ease and soften. Winnie revived, sniffing, and was able to ride the horse again, perched behind May. And to her oft-repeated question, "Are we almost there?" the welcome answer came at last. "Only a few more minutes now." A wide stand of dark pines rose up, loomed nearer, and suddenly Jessie was crying. "We're home. This is it, Winnie Foster." And he and Miles raced on and disappeared among the trees. The horse followed, turning onto a rutted path, lumpy with roots, and it was as if it had slipped in under a giant colander. The late sun's brilliance could penetrate only in scattered glimmers, and everything was silent and untouched. The ground muffled with moss and sliding needles, the graceful arms of the pines stretched out protectively in every direction, and it was cool, blessedly cool and green. The horse picked his way carefully, and then ahead the path dropped down a steep embankment, and beyond that, Winnie, peering around May's bulk, saw a flash of color and a dazzling sparkle. Down the embankment they swayed, and there it was, a plain, homely little house, barn red, and below it the last of the sun flashing on the wrinkled surface of a tiny lake. "Oh, look!" cried Winnie. "Water!" At the same time they heard two enormous splashes, two voices roaring with pleasure. "It don't take 'em more'n a minute to pile into that pond," said May, beaming. "Well, you can't blame 'em in heat like this. You can go in too if you want." Then they were at the door of the little house, and Tuck was standing there. "Where's the child?" he demanded, for Winnie was hidden behind his wife. "The boys say you brung along a real, honest-to-goodness, natural child." "So I did," said May, sliding off the horse, "and here she is." Winnie's shyness returned at once when she saw the big man with his sad face and baggy trousers. But as he gazed at her, the warm, pleasing feeling spread through her again. For Tuck's head tilted to one side. His eyes went soft, and the gentlest smile in the world displaced the melancholy creases of his cheeks. He reached up to lift her from the horse's back and said, "There's just no words to tell you how happy I am to see you. It's the finest thing that's happened in—" He interrupted himself, setting Winnie on the ground, and turned to May. "Does she know?" "Course she knows," said May. "That's why I brung her back. Winnie, here's my husband, Angus Tuck. Tuck, meet Winnie Foster." "How do, Winnie Foster," said Tuck, shaking Winnie's hand rather solemnly. "Well, then," he straightened and peered down at her, and Winnie, looking back into his face, saw an expression there that made her feel like an unexpected present, wrapped in pretty paper and tied with ribbons, in spite of May's blue hat, which still enveloped her head. "Well, then," Tuck repeated, "seeing you know, I'll go on and say this is the finest thing that's happened, at least 80 years. Chapter 10. Winnie had grown up with order. She was used to it. Under the pitiless double assaults of her mother and grandmother, the cottage where she lived was always squeaking clean, mopped and swept and scoured into limp submission. There was no room for carelessness, no putting things off until later. The Foster women had made a fortress out of duty. Within it, they were indomitable. That's a hard word to say. And Winnie was in training. So she was unprepared unprepared for the homely little house beside the pond, unprepared for the gentle eddies of dust, the silver cobwebs, the mouse who lived and welcomed to him in a table drawer. There were only 3 rooms. The kitchen came first, with an open cabinet where dishes were stacked in perilous towers without the least regard for their varying dimensions. There was an enormous black stove and a metal sink, and every surface, every wall was piled and strewn and hung with everything imaginable, from onions to lanterns to wooden spoons to wash tubs. And in a corner stood Tuck's forgotten shotgun. The parlor came next, where the furniture, loose and sloping with age, was set about helter-skelter. An ancient Greek plush sofa lolled alone in the center, like yet another mossy fallen log, facing a soot-streaked fireplace still deep in last winter's ashes. The table with the drawer that housed the mouse was pushed off, also alone, into a far corner, and 3 armchairs and an elderly rocker stood about aimlessly, like strangers at a party, ignoring each other. Beyond this was the bedroom, where a vast and tipsy brass bed took up most of the space, but there was room beside it for the washstand with the lonely mirror, and opposite its foot a cavernous oak wardrobe from which leaked the faint smell of camphor. Up a steep flight of narrow stairs was a dusty loft. "That's where the boys sleep when they're home," May explained, and that was all. And yet it was not quite all, for there was everywhere evidence of their activities, May's and Tuck's. Her sewing, patches and scraps of bright cloth, half-completed quilts and braided rugs, a bag of cotton batting with wisps of its contents, like snow drifting into cracks and corners, the arms of the sofa webbed with strands of thread and dangerous with needles. His wood carving, curly shavings furring the floor, and little heaps of splinters and chips, every surface dim with the sawdust of countless sandings, limbs of unassembled dolls and wooden soldiers, a ship model propped on the mouse's table, waiting for its glue to dry, and a stack of wooden bowls, their sides smooth to velvet, the topmost bowl filled with a jumble of big wooden spoons and forks, like dry bleached bones. "We make things to sell," said Maeve, surveying the mess approvingly. And still this was not all, for on the old beam ceiling of the parlor streaks of light swam and danced and wavered like a bright mirage, reflected through the windows from the sunlit surface of the pond. There were bowls of daisies everywhere, gay, white, and yellow, and over everything was the clean, sweet smell of the water and its weeds, the chatter of a swooping kingfisher, the carol and trill of a dozen other kinds of bird, and occasionally the thrilling bass note of an unastonished bullfrog at ease somewhere along the muddy banks. Into it all came Winnie, eyes wide and very much amazed. It was a whole new idea to her that people could live in such disarray, but at the same time she was charmed. It was comfortable. Climbing behind May up the stairs to see the loft, she thought to herself, maybe it's because they think they have forever to clean it up. And this was followed by another thought, far more revolutionary. Maybe they just don't care. "The boys don't be home very much," said May, as they come up into the half-light of the loft. "But when they are, they bed up here. There's plenty of room." The loft was cluttered, too, with all kinds of odds and ends, but there were 2 mattresses rolled out on the floor, and fresh sheets and blankets were folded almost nearly on each, waiting to be spread. "Where do they go when they're away?" asked Winnie. "What do they do?" "Oh," said May, "they go different places, do different things. They work at what jobs they can get, try to bring home some of their money. Miles can do carpentering, and he's pretty fair blacksmith, too. Jesse now, he don't never ever seem too settled in himself. Of course he's young." She stopped and smiled. "That sounds funny, don't it? Still, it's true, just the same. So Jesse, he does what strikes him at the moment, working in the fields or in saloons, things like that. Whatever he comes across. But they can't stay on in any one place for long, you know. None of us can. People get to wondering," she sighed. "We've been in this house about as long as we're there, going on 20 years. It's a right nice place. Tuck's got so's he's real attached to it. Then, too, it's off by itself. Plenty of fish in the pond, not too far from the towns around. When we need things, we go sometimes to one, sometimes the next, so people don't come to notice us much. And we sell what we can. But I guess we'll be moving on one of these days. It's just about time." It sounded rather sad to Winnie, never to belong anywhere. "That's too bad," she said, glancing shyly at May. "Always moving around and never having any friends or anything." But May shrugged off this observation. "Tuck and me, we got each other," she said, "and that's a lot. The boys now, they go their separate ways. There's some different, don't always get on too good. But they come home whenever the spirit moves, and every 10 years, first week of August, they meet at the spring and come home together, so's we can be a family again for a little while. That's why we was there this morning. One way or another, it all works out." She folded her arms and nodded more to herself than to Winnie. "Life's got to be lived, no matter how long or short," she said calmly. "You got to take what comes. We just go along, like everybody else, one day at a time. Funny. We don't feel no different. Leastways, I don't. Sometimes I forget about what's happened to us, forget it altogether. And then sometimes it comes over me and I wonder why it happened to us. We're plain as salt, us Tucks. We don't deserve no blessings, if it is a blessing. And likewise, I don't see how we deserve to be cursed, if it's a curse. Still, there's no use trying to figure why things fall the way they do. Things just are, and fussing don't bring changes. Tuck, now, he's got a few other ideas, but I expect he'll tell you. There, the boys are in from the pond." Winnie heard a burst of voices downstairs, and in a moment Miles and Jessie were climbing to the loft. "Here, child," said May hastily. "Hide your eyes. Boys, are you decent? What'd you put out on to swim in? I got Winnie up here. Do you hear me?" "For goodness sake, Ma," said Jessie, emerging from the stairwell. "You think we're going to march around and out all together with Winnie Foster in the house?" And Miles behind him said, "We just jumped in with our clothes on, too hot and tired to shed 'em." It was true. They stood there side by side with their wet clothes plastered to their skins, little pools of water collecting at their feet. "Well," said May, relieved. "All right, find something dry to put on. Your pa's got supper nearly ready." And she hustled Winnie down the narrow stairs. And that's the end of Chapter 10, and the end of our reading for today. So, until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his